Our text is from the Gospel of John, the 6th chapter. It can be found on page 868 of your Pew Bible. It includes verse 35 and then jumps to verse 41 through 51. To make sure we include verse 35, which is where Jesus says to the crowd, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Then the Jews began to complain about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They were saying, "Is not this Jesus, son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" Jesus answered them, "Do not complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me. And I will raise that person up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Last week at church, we were in the same chapter of John's Gospel, thinking through the aftermath of the latest sign that Jesus had done. He had just fed the 5,000 and many more from 5 loaves and 2 fish, and did such an amazing job that there were 12 baskets of leftovers. No one had to show their belief card at the door. Jesus put no qualifications on who got to eat or who didn't get to eat. Like, "Oh, you're not old enough," or "Oh, you're too old," or "You're not smart enough," or "You're just wrong. No food for you." Everybody ate and was filled. But what did that sign mean? The lesson itself was actually very simple, not easy to accept, but truly simple. The lesson was that God feeds and that people, all people, are fed. That's it. God does the work of feeding. People receive God's work. Well, that is not the lesson the people took away from the feeding. They thought it meant Jesus was going to be the guy who's going to bring back the glory of King David, back when Israel was a dominant nation in their neighborhood 1,000 years ago. So the people want to make Jesus their king, which makes Jesus skedaddle away in a boat. He eventually withdraws to the mountain by himself, John tells us, and when the people finally find Jesus after hunting for him, he takes advantage of the opportunity to try to explain what is on offer from God. It's not just bread to fill your belly, which in this conversation is obviously not only to be taken literally, but also as a metaphor for temporary, worldly stuff that may fill us up in a moment, but then passes away in the next moment. Like a good meal eventually gives way to renewed hunger. Worldly power and military might and a strong economy, they all eventually give way to the other side of all those coins. What is on offer from God is not just bread, but bread beyond bread. Jesus is offering something that feeds, something that fills up in a timeless, eternal way, in a way that will never pass away. And that's something, that bread, is himself. At the end of the text we talked about last week, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. You can just imagine the looks on their faces. They were asking, what are you going to do for us? How will you do it? The kinds of questions we would ask a politician, because that's kind of how they're regarding Jesus at this point, as they want to make him their king. What will you do? How will you do it? His answer, I'm not offering you a bunch of doings. I'm offering you me. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. He's talking about so much more than worldly power, which is not where their heads are at. So the Jews began to complain about him because he said, I am the bread of life that came down from heaven. Why are they complaining? Because isn't this Jesus? Like, son of Joseph? We know that guy. We know his parents. I have come down from heaven. Have you? Like, have you, Jesus? This happens to the best of us. All of us, I think, sometimes when what I already know blinds me to what I actually do not already know, you know? Like years ago when our 3 kids were all very small and we were on vacation far, far away, we rented a house for a week, as we do with our best friends. Back then, once we got to the house, we stayed at that house for the whole week. No restaurants, no touristy activities, just rest. Hanging out as much as we can. It was on a beach. That was free to get to. I mentioned that we didn't really have to spend any money or anything once we got there because at the end of this week, as we were packing up and heading out, I could not find my wallet anywhere. Checkout was 10 a.m. The kids were up at, 7 a.m., 5 a.m. Doesn't matter. Anyway, we had a long drive home, but for 3 hours, basically, I tore apart every square foot of that house. I was certain that one of the kids had flushed it down the toilet or threw it in the ocean or something, right? My license, my cash, my cards, all the things. I knew it wasn't in my car, which is why I spent 3 hours searching the house, the yard, the swing set, our bags, the path to the beach, the whole beach, under every stroller, on top of every appliance, in the VCR, everywhere. Finally, we gave up. I left a note with the home's owner, and I was resigned to having lost my wallet. I am anxious about this, just not like thinking about it now. An hour down the road, we pull in for gas, and I am just, so angry at myself. Whoever the child was right behind me had kicked off their blanket or whatever, so I opened the door to pull it back up over them. And as I did, I saw under my driver's seat, like way under tucked way in there, my wallet that I knew was not in my car. And that's when I remembered I had put it there when we arrived a week ago to keep it safe from myself. What we think we already know can truly blind us to what we do not already know. What do you think you know? Have you ever assumed you knew what a person was going to be like once you heard what they do for work? Like, oh. Or once you see them in person, maybe put a face to a name as though all of a sudden their size or their shape or their skin color or their age tells you way more about them than when they actually just open their mouth and start talking. Or maybe you've sized someone up once you hear what team they root for or where they're from. There's all kinds of things we think we know about people before we actually get to know them at all. It's all an effort to control, right? We want to manage our own expectations about how we're going to be received, whether this person's going to like me or whether this person's worth my efforts at getting to know or not. Well, these people who have hunted down Jesus to be their king, who have known him, and who think they know his parents, they think they know all they need to know about him in order to follow him as a worldly leader. But Jesus makes this claim that challenges them to make a very different choice. The claim is, I am bread beyond bread. I am the bread of life from heaven. From heaven? They're looking at each other like, dude's from Nazareth. And that is not heaven. Like, certainly not. But that is the claim Jesus makes, that he is from heaven, so they have a choice to make. To believe him or dismiss him. Why believe him? Well, he did just feed 5,000 and many more people from just a few loaves and a couple fish. They were there for that. He healed a royal official's son who was at the point of death. He turned water to wine. His teachings, his healings had become famous, and they had just experienced one for themselves. But why not believe him? Because they know his parents. They think they already know what there is to know. Faced with the claim of Jesus that he's from heaven, they can either stick with what they think they already know and walk away, go back to a life untransformed, a life unresurrected, a life without this new hope, a life without this bread from heaven, or they could embrace who Jesus says he is. They could receive all that that brings. Hope, transformation, new life. They could be moved into a whole new way of life that they do not know, a life they do not control, a life that is simply open to all the goodness of God, which in its serving of the neighbor, in its love and mercy, will lead to a cross here and there, but will never end at any cross. Not even death is going to end this way promised by the bread of life, beyond life. There's this whole story, this whole God-led way of living and being that is broader and deeper and more complicated and more mysterious and more beautiful than anything any of us can imagine. And in this moment when Jesus has just shown them a sign of all that it is, feeding everyone, no matter who they are, in this moment of revealing the kind of feeding work God does and will always do, Jesus presents those who have been fed with a choice. Believe in him and what they just saw and experienced, or trust in what they think they already know. Kind of reminds me of a wedding day when one says vows to an other, I will be faithful to you till death parts us. Well, you can't know what that means. What's going to happen between now and when death parts us? It won't all be good. We know that. There will be mistakes. There will be accidents. There will be bad luck, maybe worse. Lots of stuff that's going to require forgiveness and all the work that goes into forgiveness. And you're promising on this day to be faithful on that day, and then, and again then, and again. It's a lot like what Jesus is doing in John's chapter 6. He's making a proposal of a certain kind. He's proposing God's steadfast love in the form of bread that is beyond just bread, in the form of himself, that we would live life beyond just life. His audience then, and we now are faced then with this proposal, to be drawn into God's kind of love and faithfulness, or to not be drawn into anything, but to remain chained to our own limited ambitions, our own small little goals, our own same old preferences, so that we can just keep on believing the things we already believe and have always believed, so that we can keep seeing the world. We've already seen the world that way, so that we can keep on resenting the people we have always resented. We can keep fearing the things we've always feared. We can keep assuming the assumptions that we've always assumed. That's a lot easier. You may know a few weeks ago I got to go to New Orleans with 24 young people and 4 other adult leaders for the ELCA youth gathering. For more than 100 years, Lutherans like us have been doing these kinds of gatherings that, at this point, are meant to be educational. There's a service component, lots of fellowship. Well, if you're a teenager with lots of options as to how you can spend your time in the summer, and your pastor, like me, says, hey, There's this great experience just a 21-hour bus ride away in the 95-degree, 90% humidity of New Orleans in July, where there's this great experience of education and service and fellowship. Just trust me, it's worth your time and effort. How do you think most people might respond to that proposal? So we got 24 kids to say yes. So that's miracle number one. Most with a nudge or two from parents who love them and remember the promises they made at their child's baptism. And it is my practice on the way down and the way back up from these events to take advantage of this opportunity I have as I have a captive audience with each young person in a bus. 15 minutes. 15 minutes each, of course, takes 6 hours for 24 kids, so my bus ride flies by. I got started before we were even an hour down the road. Now remember, these are the kids that got on the bus, but that did not mean they all wanted to be on the bus. More than 0 of them, as I asked, how are you feeling about this trip? What are you most looking forward to? And what are your greatest concerns? More than 0 said something like, well, I hate long bus rides. I'm concerned about the food and the heat, and I don't really like crowds, and it sounds like it's just going to be a crowd wherever we go. What am I looking forward to? Seeing an alligator on the Bayou tour, which was the first thing we were going to do once we got there, which, of course, is their pastor, who'd been trying to get them excited about this experience since January, an experience I believe and know to be so very powerful. I heard some of these responses as though I had somehow failed. But it turns out my job wasn't to generate excitement or get them to want to go before they got there. My job was to simply get them on the bus, because God did the rest. The youth gathering is our text from John today, come to life. Jesus says, no one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me, and I will raise that person up on the last day. That drawing someone in work that God does, we adults on that trip saw God doing that all week through the mass gatherings each night where almost 17,000 people were filling a basketball stadium and doing all the things that we do at those gatherings. We saw God doing this work through the wonderfully silly high school dances hosted at hotels around town after each of those mass gatherings each night, through our brief but sweltering service project, and yes, even through that Bayou tour where we not only saw alligators, plural, but got to hold one. Yay. It was like a foot long. And yes, I held one. God the Father, as John would say, drew those kids in, and those kids went along for the ride. Each of them was faced with a proposal to be drawn into God's kind of love and faithfulness, or to not be drawn into anything but to remain chained to their own limited understanding of God, of life, of what they can hope for, of who they can be, of what they're called to do. All that stuff, what we get to hope for, who we can be, what we're called to do, all of it we claim as Christians is made richer and more meaningful by God. And I saw that to be true again at this most recent gathering as God did God's work. Those kids could have said, I already know what there is to know about all this. They could have allowed their feelings of blind them to what there was to see. But to a person, all 24 of them saw. On the way back in my follow-up captive audience bus ride conversation, when I asked for words or phrases to describe the week that they'd had, they said things like rejuvenating, inspirational, life-changing, fulfilling. Wow. The good news is, the good news today is that God does this kind of drawing in work at all. But the other good news about the good news is that God doesn't only make this kind of proposal to us once. This is not a one-time offer from God like, okay, Jesus is the bread of life, take it or leave it. God chooses to make this offer again and again and again, including today, that you and that we all would be drawn in, so that we would live out God's mercy and kindness and joy wherever we go from here. So that we would be drawn away from our own ambitions and our own wants, drawn toward care for creation, love for neighbor, hope for this world. Thanks be to God. Amen. I invite you to stand as we sing.